In our previous video, we went over how there are three great planes of reality, and we explained how the physical plane is simply the space-time universe that we are in, the mental plane is the area where thoughts exist behind space-time, and how the spiritual plane is where our emotions exist behind space-time. In this video, I want to go over another plane, which is called the astral plane, as well as some of the research into near-death experiences and PSI phenomena. At this point, a note should be made on the nature of what is often termed astral projection or out-of-body experience. These terms are often used synonymously, but they are in fact different, since astral projections are only a subset of out-of-body experiences. What is commonly thought of as an astral projection, where the individual is able to move around in the physical realm and see his or her own body in real time, is not a real astral projection, but it's what's called an etheric projection. The exact nature of astral projections are a bit different and involves the subject being able to leave the physical plane entirely. Just as a physical world is a virtual reality, the physical body is an avatar for the mind, thus the body does not produce consciousness, rather it houses it as a vehicle or interference for the physical world. After all, this should be obvious as we do not know of the brain's existence from immediate awareness, but we can know about the existence of consciousness from immediate awareness. The two are not the same. The brain is really the extrinsic appearance of our consciousness. So-called astral projections can easily be accounted for by the mind leaving its physical avatar and exploring the realm beneath the virtual reality, and given the description in our previous video about the collective inner mental plane, then this should be no surprise. People that have astral projections have reported being able to move around great distances by just thinking about it or thinking about another location. Likewise, they also report that there is no spatial or temporal categories that apply in the astral realm, and this would of course be expected as a realm beneath space-time. Now, some like to merely dismiss these reports and say that it is just hallucinations, but we will demonstrate that there are cases where near-death experiences cannot be explained on materialistic grounds, but rather can only be explained on idealism or mentalism. The first thing is that blind people have experienced sight in near-death experiences. In a study conducted on 31 cases where blind individuals reported near-death experiences, it was found that they all reported the ability to see. Half of them were blind from birth and had no prior concept of vision. What's remarkable is that vision, like the other senses, requires a brain to organize neural connections in order to process it. People cannot simply go from blind to full sight without developing the neural architecture to produce such connections. Yet despite this, people surveyed in the study were able to experience vision with no correlated neurostructures to host it. The second piece of evidence has to do with many cases with subjects reporting back detailed knowledge from outside of the room. In these cases, the doctors knew the patients were declared dead. In one instance, a nurse had removed a man's dentures while he was in coma and placed them in a crash cart. A week later, after coming out of his coma, he was able to identify the location of his dentures and that the nurse had taken them. He had also given an accurate detailed description of the room where they had attempted to resonate him. Far from being rare cases, this sort of thing is actually quite common and can be found in the literature on near-death experiences. Janice Holden of the University of Northern Texas has documented 107 reports of this nature, all found in public literature, and given that these accounts are both documented in public literature and are comprehensively peer-reviewed, they cannot be simply dismissed outright. The third piece of evidence is that there is increased mental function without corresponding brain activity. This is taking place in the study of psychedelic drugs. The first study showed that despite a higher richness of experiences reported by the subject compared to those with the placebo measurements that use in fMRI scans, they indicated that these drugs cause a decrease in brain activity. In the second study, the same conclusion was drawn, namely that an increase in the richness of experience from psychedelic drugs would actually decrease brain activity. So under both these studies, reduction in brain activity leads to an increase in experiences. All of these examples defy materialistic explanations. However, all of these examples can be easily accounted for under idealism and the principle of mentalism. The mind, in the form of the spirit, predates the body and would exist behind the virtual reality within the wave function of Hilbert space. The body is no more different than a digital avatar in a computer game. So, when the avatar is killed, the player by no means dies. The portion of the spirit projected onto the avatar is in what we call the soul. So, once we die and leave the virtual reality, so to speak, that we could re-entangle with the spirit at the level of subconsciousness that is to us now, and in all the information and mental facilities lost upon the decay of the brain's entanglement would immediately be regained. This fact explains how people who are blind from birth were able to experience vision in a near-death experience. The facility of vision may not be based in the brain, but may be entangled in the spirit beyond physical space-time. It also explains the seamlessly space-time and timeless nature of many of these states, where the subject felt that the ordinary categories of space and time could break down, and thus given the mentalistic framework, no contradiction exists between reports of the afterlife and the findings of modern neuroscience. So the conclusion is that near-death experiences can all be explained with the Hermetic philosophy. Now, one of the most widely known phenomena considered to be paranormal or supernatural is what is called PSI phenomena. The phenomena of PSI is heavily contested, but there exists very good evidence for it that has been established for it. So-called psychic abilities of extrasensory perception, such as telepathy, clairaudience, and precognition, have been studied in laboratory conditions in many laboratories. These include the Princeton's Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the Institute of Noetic Science, and the Global Consciousness Project and the Rhine Institute. I will now attempt to show that the evidence for PSI is so strong that it can be considered as scientifically proven. The first scientific proof is the more significant experiment conducted by the Dutch psychologist Brugman in 1923. Here, the experimenters determined one square at random from a 6x8 squared checkerboard, and the subject was asked to select the right square from behind the curtain. The subject's galvanic skin response was tested to see if there is a difference between when he was about to select the right or wrong square. The experimenter would then try to tell the subject through his thoughts which of the squares to select. The results of these experiments were highly significant. Out of 197 trials, just under a third of them, 60, were successful. The odds of this happening without the subject telepathically sensing the thoughts of the experimenter was calculated to be 121 trillion to 1. In science, the concept of standard deviation, denoted by the Greek letter stigma, is used to mathematically determine the level of scientific proof for something. 5 stigma, which is the accepted scientific standard for scientific proof, denotes a probability of 1 in 1,744,278. The results of the experiments far exceed the standard by 7 orders of magnitude. The second scientific proof is the ESP card test conducted by the Rhine Institute. Here, a deck of 25 cards was used. Each card had a symbol stamped on it with a total of 5 symbols with 5 cards of each type. The deck was shuffled each time, and a person would select a card in secret and try to mentally send the symbol to a recipient. The recipient would then try to determine what symbol was selected. Over the span of 188 such experiments, the results were highly significant. To illustrate how significant this is, it would take 428,000 more tests averaging at the chance of probability to cancel out the effects of the studies, providing statistically significant effects in favor of PSI. The third scientific proof is the Pierce-Pratt distance telepathy test. This was similar to ESP card tests, except in this case, the test sampled 1,850 individual trials out of 74 tests and recorded 558 successful attempts. The expected number of positive attempts based on pure probability was nearly 200 below this though, which places the odds of the result not being caused by PSI to be 1 in many billions. This is again well above the 5 stigma standard and should be significant and sufficient scientific proof for the existence of PSI. Now, given that PSI has been long established as a real phenomena by scientific standards, we should now ask as to why this has not been accepted by some members of the scientific community. The answer is that something being established via a scientific proof is different than being accepted as a true by members of the scientific community. As is apparent from the evidence, the skeptics are either ignorant of the evidence or are using non-scientific opinions to ignore the actual scientific evidence. If we take a closer look at some of the so-called skepticism, the prioritization of these non-scientific opinions becomes obvious. A quote from a famous neuropsychologist, Donald Hebb, makes the source of the skepticism of PSI very obvious. Quote, "Why do we not accept ESP as a psychological fact? Rhine has offered enough evidence to convince us in almost any other issue. Personally, I do not accept ESP for a moment because it does not make sense. My external criteria, both of physics and of physiology say that ESP is not a fact despite the behavioral evidence that it has been reported. I cannot see what any other basis my colleagues have for rejecting it. Ryan may have turned out to be right, improbable as it is, and that my own rejection of his view is in a literal sense prejudice. First, it should be noted that this rejection of the evidence due to Donald words as literal prejudice does nothing to discredit the evidence. Rather, the informed viewer should recognize that this actually discredits the skeptics. For instance, if such a thing as the skeptical James Randi Educational Foundation were credible in its skepticism, labs such as those who I mentioned previously would have already won the $1 million from the framed Randi Challenge. In fact, in a recent study, Eskil Kartina has reviewed evidence for PSI phenomena and concluded that the evidence provides cumulative support for the reality of PSI, which cannot be readily explained away by the quality of the studies, fraud, selective reporting, experimental or analytical incompetence, or any other frequent criticisms. The evidence for PSI is comparable to the established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. Now, some try to say that PSI phenomena is incompatible to physics. However, telepathy wouldn't contradict known physics if it is properly understood. If we look at how these phenomena are explained with the Hermetic physics framework, it becomes apparent that this is not the case. According to the physics we have thus far derived, thoughts exist within the universal wave function and in turn exist outside of space and time. If systems in two people's brains become entangled, then their thoughts would share the same wave function behind space-time, thereby forming an information channel between the two. Thus, they could sense each other's thoughts via this shared channel, and the means by which they would be linked would not be physical, meaning it would not be within space-time. In other words, what is meant by information as being transmitted by entanglement means that classical information cannot be transmitted from entanglement. But in the case of telepathy, the thoughts being read are not classical information, nor is there any decoherence or collapse of the superposition at any point, and the reason for this is that our thoughts are not made of classical information at all. Our thoughts exist within the wave function in a state of superpositions from the start. So, since quantum information is not destroyed upon collapse, as no such collapse occurs, then telepathy and related phenomena are quite compatible with the physics that we know. Skeptics like to assume that the mind must be classical or a non-quantum object and not non-local, but both these assumptions are what we would expect if the mind is not fundamental to reality, and if nothing exists beyond space-time. But neither of these assumptions are necessary if one abandons a materialistic framework of thinking. Physics can work fine without these assumptions. So, there is no mystery as to how the astral plane works, or how near-death experiences works, or how PSI phenomena works.